To the Washington offices of a newly established division of the United States Army Air Forces in the critical summer of 1942 came a dramatic dispatch from Cairo.
Have 5 C-47s stand by to load special cargo.
Prepare to load 4 B-24s with rush cargo for Special Project 302.
Cargo for Special Project 302 will be delivered at airport at 1640 EWT.
In this historic hurry call for munitions for a fighting ally lay the first severe test of the Army's fledgling Air Transport Command. A call to deliver within 72 hours by air and by air alone 25,000 rounds of armor-piercing anti-tank ammunition to General Auchinleck's men in Egypt. On that black day, Hitler's Africa Corps was but 70 miles from Alexandria, key to the Middle East, to Suez and to India. Rommel believed victory to be within his grasp. But with their ammunition supply replenished and their courage unimpaired, the gunners of the British 8th Army stopped Rommel's armor in its tracks and turned the tide of the Desert War. Today, ATC is the world's greatest airline. Its bases circle the earth, and its thousands of Army pilots, now flying side by side with hundreds of civilian pilots, have become as familiar with cities like Karachi, Cairo, and Chongqing as with New York, Los Angeles, or Albuquerque. For ATC is not only international, but global in its operations. Flying key military personnel and high-priority freight from continent to continent for America and its allies has become normal routine. Most dramatic of the ATC's duties has become its transportation of supplies, drugs to save fighting men's lives, and the thousands of critical items of equipment needed to keep bombers or fighters in the air in distant war zones. Strict priority ratings assigned by the High Command in response to the needs of field commanders determine the character and flow of cargo handled by the ATC's men and planes. But on occasion, there is a super priority to be taken care of.
Say, how about my laundry?
Where'd you leave it?
At Khartoum. 3 shirts, shorts, and a pair of socks.
We'll get it for you. It'll catch up with you in Florida.
Okay.
When ATC was first organized, its only planes were converted bombers. Soon were added a full third of America's existing commercial airliners, to be followed by specially designed cargo planes. From the U.S. airlines, the ATC obtained not only planes, but also invaluable experienced personnel, executives, pilots, and ground crews, all possessing the know-how of operating not only the vast American Airways network, but also routes across the Atlantic and Pacific and to South America. Now that war has proved the urgency and practicality of air cargo transport, more production facilities are being devoted to the making of cargo planes whose range, speed, and payload meet the requirements of global war. The U.S. public's interest in the world of air has grown and broadened as the scope and accomplishments of wartime aviation have become better known.
It's impressive.
They flew my boy back here from New Guinea in 72 hours. Just 3 days, and he was here.
I'll bet you were glad.
Oh, after the war, we'll fly everywhere. Paris, China, India. And believe me, I'm not going to miss out on it. I'll take trips like that myself.
It's a small world, after all.
You're telling me.
Today, combat aviation, hurling thousands of tons of bombs on Festung Europa, has impaired Hitler's ability to wage a protracted war. And in the months to come, ever larger fleets of bombers and fighters may well bring to Germany such destruction as to make a Nazi counteroffensive impossible. From Washington's Pentagon building, General Henry H. Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces and himself a command pilot, is directing the air operations of 14 widely dispersed combat commands, located in every fighting zone, each with its problem of logistics. Under General Arnold, handling the flying of supplies to all American fronts, is Major General Harold Lee George, Chief of ATC. Most pressing duty of General George's ATC is to assure a continual flow of combat planes to the fighting fronts. To this end, ATC's ferrying division flies hundreds of planes each week from the factories to operating bases in the combat zone. Many a combat plane is flown by its own crew over routes pioneered by ATC's cargo planes. By the highly developed ferrying system, planes which would have taken months to arrive by sea are now, in a matter of days or even hours, delivered ready for battle to bomber bases in England, Australia, North Africa, and even to distant China, where for long months the fighter planes of Chennault's Flying Tigers had stood alone as a symbol of the air power America has pledged to provide. All operations of the Air Transport Command, whether ferrying combat planes or moving priority cargo and munitions, are governed by principles and techniques perfected in the past by civil airlines and adapted by the Army to the conditions of global war. ATC personnel follows an exact routine. Before pilots and crews fly on to their next base, they must conform to the many procedures which ensure security and efficiency. To meet any conditions of weather or terrain, and to provide for changes of destination, special equipment is available at the airports of embarkation. In regular conferences, pilots and navigators are thoroughly briefed on the flight conditions they will encounter on their next hop.
It's a nice long runway. You won't have any trouble except there are some low mountains along the south end of the runway.
Are there any restrictions along this route?
There are some naval vessels in this area. You're not allowed to fly over any naval vessel.
Radio operators are informed of any local regulations of radio control, which they must observe.
When at least 2 hours out from any station at your destination, you're to call this station and send your estimated time of arrival message. In this message, you will contain the call sign, the type, and serial number of your aircraft. Also, you're to request the weather for this particular field.
Pilots and navigators can check and recheck on detailed charts the course which they will fly. Ever increasing at the airports of ATC is the number of cargo planes arriving and departing each day. For today, the monthly tonnage handled by ATC, whose exact figures are a closely guarded military secret, is rising to totals which a year ago would have seemed astronomical. On the distant and difficult land fronts of the South Pacific, cargo planes have proved their effectiveness in moving in, on short notice and in ever greater quantities, arms and equipment which have been decisive factors in the campaign. In island warfare, where surprise attacks have won for the United Nations forces strategic advantages of tremendous importance, the speed of reinforcement, which air supply alone could give, is proving to be a trump card against the Japanese. One of ATC's busiest routes since the opening of the Mediterranean theater of war has been that across the South Atlantic from Brazil to Africa. Today, ATC planes are flying supplies across ocean and jungle to deposit them at otherwise inaccessible points far removed from ports or railheads. At villages deep in the heart of Africa are intermediate bases which have been equipped as way stations on the African supply route. At each base, the routines of ATC are carefully followed. Arrivals and departures are checked to schedules in the battle to keep abreast of the Army's stiff program of air deliveries. Planes are serviced and refueled by ground crews familiar with all types of aircraft using the route. In case of emergency, spare parts are always on hand. Any information airmen may have picked up en route is carefully recorded and collated for the benefit of following flights.
Bob, did you have any trouble at all with your navigation?
The only trouble we had was with the natives.
What was that?
Oh, if you go out to your airplane at night, they'll take a shot at you.
Today, there is no military Shangri-La to which the ATC does not fly, even if 2 continents or 3 must be crossed by air. To most nations now fighting the Axis enemy, even to those fighting on remote and isolated fronts, the planes which bear the emblem of ATC have become frequent and welcome visitors. To our allies, they are bringing new stocks of critical war material and technical military personnel. Through ATC facilities, Army personnel can be brought in from the fighting fronts for transfers or to make first-hand reports on what they have seen and learned in battle. Most ATC routes are working at full capacity, but when space is available, Army cargo planes bring back strategic materials, such as natural rubber for U.S. war industry. No work of the sky transports has been more generally praised than the swift evacuation of wounded and invalided men from field hospitals to base hospitals, where they can receive complete medical and surgical care. Often in flight, nurses and doctors have given emergency transfusions of plasma, which have saved scores of lives. The flying hospitals of ATC are symbolic of the new vistas of post-war aviation, of the aviation whose chief purpose will be no longer destruction, but reconstruction, whose aim will be not to shatter, but to build. For in the work of America's Air Transport Command, modern technical genius is showing how the airways of war can become airways of peace, how aviation can bring to the remote corners of the world a new conception of the world itself. Already in lands long considered backward, men of those lands are learning to do work which is shaping their habits and their aspirations for the future. Today, their airport jobs are those of routine maintenance. Tomorrow, they may be technicians and pilots, partners, perhaps, in the adventurous world to follow victory and peace. With victory still unattained and peace still far away, the miracle of the global airways, which will unite and serve the world of the future, remains a promise, but not yet a fact. What benefits or problems the air transport of the future may bring still remains to be determined by the wisdom and energy of the diplomats and statesmen of the post-war world. But in a mere space of wartime months, America and her allies have shown to the world that the material and technical problem of establishing and maintaining global airways can be and has been solved, and that no physical obstacle can block man's inevitable conquest of the world of air.
Another weapon in America's arsenal for global war was the skill and experience of our great commercial airlines operating under contract to the War Department. July 1942, this ferrying service was reorganized as the Air Transport Command under veteran flyer General Harold George. In the company of C.R. Smith, his deputy, they inspected new installations. By summer, ATC routes touched all 6 continents. The growth of the Air Transport Command closely paralleled the expansion of the Air Force itself. In less than 2 years, sky bridges connected practically every corner of the world. ATC skywagons, guided by the Army Airways communications system, crossed the Atlantic on an average of 1 every 13 minutes. The broader Pacific, every hour and a half. And so ATC, by supplying both men and machines to world battlefronts, was preparing to smash the Axis threat.
Urgently needed cargoes were carried by air. The airplane at last became a major means of transportation. The United States Army Air Transport Command opened air routes that covered 110,000 miles. They brought airplane parts for the armies in Egypt, repair parts for tanks in the battle areas, hand grenades to the soldiers in the Pacific. They dropped food and medical supplies to isolated forces in the jungles of New Guinea. The tide had begun to turn. The United Nations were at last in a position to take the offensive.
This is a global war. To understand the extent of our air operation, we must take a global point of view. You're looking at the world spread out from the North Pole. Today we have 15 air forces, all joined together by the network of the Air Transport Command. 110,000 miles of regularly scheduled routes, 4.5 times around the world. Over these routes, the ATC ferries planes from factory to front. It transports key personnel and delivers supplies at the rate of 10 million miles a month. It will take anywhere, anything that can possibly fit into a plane. Once it delivered to Alaska a complete hospital in 36 hours. It flew a shipment of grenades from the United States to Guadalcanal in 4 days when our men needed them desperately. The little extra that can turn the tide of battle. This is the daily mission of the Air Transport Command.
On another front, supplies were only trickling through. General Arnold and Allied brass faced the fact that General Chennault's 14th Air Force had to be supplied. Some of his bomber operations had almost ceased. Following Casablanca decisions, Arnold ordered General Bissell to help the ATC India-China wing increase the airlift over the Himalayas.
We called it Flying the Hump. Here over Calcutta, India, we got an idea of how much our sky wagons were slated to carry. There was plenty. Tons of food and medicine. Tons of gasoline and bombs. Shiploads of them every day. Even this was only a fraction of what would come. First, while still crated, supplies moved overland by train, due north about 800 miles. This was the slow part of the long journey. Then, near the border of Tibet, our supplies were parceled out to several airfields, like Chabwa, largest of the hump terminals. Here, too, although there was plenty of manpower, the transfer methods were primitive. Until more ordnance equipment arrived, the natives helped fight the war with their bare hands. Some of these bombs weighed half a ton. After a year of operation by the 10th Air Force, we had grown from a squadron of 10 borrowed transports to a fleet of 140 high-altitude C-46s and 47s. By 1943, Hump Commander General Edward Alexander began to set records for troops, supplies, and equipment being lifted over the hump. Stretching before us were 500 miles of rough duty. Before it was over, the treacherous hump had cost us 250 transports, 250 cargoes, and 800 airmen. A high price to pay for the privilege to fly over the highest mountains in the world. We flew continuously, some of the time through Jap fighters and treacherous weather. The clouds made pretty pictures, but at 20,000 feet they could mean ice and death. No emergency landing fields among saw-toothed 5-mile-high peaks for us aerial truck drivers. Flying without fighter cover, it was always good to hear we were on the beam and minutes from landing at Kunming, China.
In December of 1943, the India-China wing carried slightly over 6,000 tons. Before the war's end, ATC had airlifted more than 1 million tons of supplies and 1 million troops over the hump. With the help of Army Airways communications system, flights eventually averaged 1 plane every minute and a half. Peak airlift was reached in July 1945, 71,000 tons in 1 month, including a fleet of jeeps. Every 4 tons of gasoline delivered used 3.5 tons to get them there. Despite the hazards and hardships, despite the costs, the Army Air Forces had conquered the hump.